we have a system where there are lots of corporations, lots of government entities that basically take our data and they manage our data. They store our data and effectively have control over our data. And some of it's legally mandated, driver's license, you actually have to hand over information in order for you to get a driver's license. Okay, that's fine. But there are other instances, particularly related to social media, particularly related to financial transactions and financial data that we largely have no control over, whether eventually the conversation goes to health records, to financial records, to your academic credentials. All of these things are areas for discussion, and a decentralized web structure with blockchain technology enables people to have more control over their individual data.
There is no concept of delete with data. Delete is user interface. Cambridge Analytica was actually a great example of this in that once that data had left Facebook, there was actually no way to be certain who had it or where it was being exchanged. There are some really interesting ways we can go about changing the way that we store data and the way that we exchange data. And so encryption or even proxy re-encryption are both really great tools that we can use to build new constructs. So when you have encrypted data, suddenly it's not about the data itself, because theoretically nobody should be able to see what's inside encrypted data unless they have keys. And so then it's about sharing the keys and sharing access. And with proxy re-encryption, that can go one step further, giving you the ability to revoke access and all sorts of interesting other properties. And so it's not a solved problem. I would say that we have a lot of research to do and a lot of experimentation to do to say, like, what changes now? How do we use these decentralized for storage? What are the next layers we need to build onto them to allow users to securely store their data, securely share or sell or exchange their data, but then later revoke that if necessary?
So one is that there isn't a honeypot. So there isn't a place you can kind of go attack as a vector to grab a ton of information or data that is attractive, more attractive than anything else. So there is an inherent element of security that comes into decentralized systems that really isn't present in centralized systems. Now, not to say centralized systems are, terrifying and horrible and insecure. That's not the case. There are obviously levels of encryption. You can kind of think of different ways to make them more secure. But the fundamental reality is that the minute you put a bunch of really interesting stuff in one place, that place becomes a target. If you simply distribute all of that same interesting stuff in a million different places or 100 different places even, then suddenly it becomes very challenging to know where to attack and where to go to get the information that, a malevolent actor might be seeking. When users actually retain control over their own information, they retain the power that comes with that. Now, that has a couple of consequences. Number one is, does it become harder to gain aggregate insights? Does everyone have to agree to convey their information in a way that will develop those very important aggregated insights? That can be collective action problems sometimes. On the other hand, it does mean that communities can come together in ways that aren't really possible today. We try, but they're challenging to accomplish and to affect. Communities can come together and make decisions about their aggregated data, what insights are generated, and who gets access to those insights. So the empowerment angle, I think, and the security angle are two things that I think are distinctions that are important between centralized infrastructures and decentralized infrastructures.
Data ownership is really problematic because data, like lots of other digital goods, is not easily owned. It's not easily controlled. But I do think what is important is having end users have a lot more transparency into their own data and a lot more control over it themselves. That doesn't mean necessarily an ownership model, but a model where they can see what data is being accessed, what is being done with it, and they have some control over it. And that could include cutting someone off, cutting an organization off, saying you don't get access to my data, or you only get access to this much data, not all of my data, and you can't sort of build up all of this information about me. So, the real thing to me is that if end users had more control and transparency into their own data, who's accessing what they're doing with it, I think that would be a really powerful change in the way that the internet works today.
We think that data on the internet is broken and can be fixed. Data DAOs and decentralized autonomous organizations that are forming around particular data sets or particular like application assets and things like that. That's quite interesting. So, imagine that me and a group of people I've never met are really passionate about preserving, climate change data. We can form a DAO that is responsible for ensuring the longevity and storage of this important, humanitarian service, data, historical records. And we get an organization that, no one individual is ever responsible for like ensuring that the data is backed up and stored on some blockchain somewhere, and that I can contribute resources and I can contribute to like, should we onboard this new data set? Well, let's all vote based on like how long we've been in the organization, or what stake we have in the project, or any number of these mediums that are popping up as ways for DAOs to interact. Imagine that an organization with no central decision maker or leadership that is involved in just the preservation of humanitarian data. That's fantastic.
So this is a concept where you actually create literally fiduciary responsibility in an institution, a trust. The trustors are the people that grant data into this trust. The data is held for their benefit. They're also the beneficiaries. And so everything that happens needs to be with them in mind, and there is accountability to them as beneficiaries. That is a really powerful concept, because you as a company, for example, don't own that data. The trust owns the data, and the trust has a different set of incentives than you do. So the permission granted from a trust to any company, any institution, a government, whatever it might be, any institution that wants to use that data is going to take into account different considerations. And so these are ways of baking in the needs of data subjects without requiring them to weigh in every single time on every single thing that has to happen.
How do we take those silos of data that used to be behind the APIs of a single actor and break them up in a way that many actors can serve your needs, but you can trust that they will, because they'll be economically incentivized to do that. And I think that there's a number of different layers before we get to that complete system, that complete set of capabilities. But the first one starts with storage. And so a number of different projects, Filecoin included, are trying to solve that storage layer. How do we get people just to store data in a way that is decentralized so that you can store it with anybody on the network, and they will be economically incentivized to store that data for you, and they'll be economically incentivized not to do bad things with that data. And bad things in this case would just be allowing that data to go corrupt, or stopping the storage of that data prematurely. And so that's sort of the base layer. And I think that we're finally getting to the point where that is working in a really exciting way. And so now it's about that second layer. How do we build things like the retrieval layers that people can pull the data back out, and you can do all sorts of interesting things with it? How do we build the mechanisms to promote data sharing or exchange or recomposition of your data in really interesting ways? And those things are sort of now just making sense, and we're really excited to do those, but they'll be quite different than the way that we've been imagining Web 2 applications. I think the final caveat to put on that at the end of it all is that I don't think that Web 2 applications will go away. They're not going to go away tomorrow. They're not going to go away in the next decade. They'll adopt a lot of these practices if we can show that they can give more value to end users or more value to society, and that's measurable. That could either be measurable in the way that people are using it, or measurable in what people are paying for. And so there's a lot of experiments and pieces we need to figure out there as a community, but it's really exciting.